In addition to his account of how the mind attains knowledge through rational intuition of the most perfect forms of being, Plato also offers an account of how the mind, through reason, generates and controls behavior. In the Republic, Plato introduces his tripartite conception of the soul. This conception of the soul has strongly influenced thinkers in the centuries that followed. According to that work, the soul has three parts: the appetitive soul, the spirit or passionate soul, and the thinking or rational soul. Each element of the soul has its own characteristic desires. The good for humans consists in the subjugation of the appetitive soul to the passionate soul, which is in turn subjugated to the rational soul. Thus, on this account, reason, emotion, and appetite become separate in Plato. One might argue that this represents the first attempt to understand the mind in terms of a set of constitutive components of the mind, the functions that those components perform, and the relationships that emerge through their interactions. At this point, we're in an excellent position to appreciate both what Plato has accomplished and the two interrelated difficulties that emerge for his ontological framework. On the one hand, Plato, as an oppositional dualist, introduces two fundamental entity categories with opposing properties. As a result, Plato inevitably encounters the problem of interaction, of understanding how it is that these two fundamentally different categories are supposed to interact with one another. Indeed, Plato tells us that in order to understand the sensible world, he must suppose that two fundamental categories of entities exist: the sensible objects and the forms. Though the sensible objects partake of the forms, that is, they interact with the forms, their central properties contradict the central properties of the forms. Thus, the sensible objects admit of divisions, whereas the forms do not. The sensible objects change, whereas the forms remain eternal and changeless. Thus, we see that the sensible objects are supposed to gain their essential nature from their interactions with the forms. Yet, by their very category, they are the sorts of things that share no common medium for interaction with the forms. In addition to this problem of interaction between his fundamental categories, Plato also encounters a problem of tenuous dualism. In discussing the nature of the soul, in talking about its functioning, Plato seems to create a notion of the soul that doesn't fit consistently and efficiently into either of his two fundamental entity categories. The soul admits of division and changes. It has parts. It has a rational part, a passionate part, an appetitive part. It interacts and changes when it reasons, when it moves. Yet, in order for the mind to attain knowledge, the mind must somehow commune with, associate with, interact with the indivisible and unchanging forms. The mind doesn't just have a problem of interaction, however. The mind doesn't fit into either category. It is more closely associated in Plato's thought with the forms, and yet it functions in Plato's thought in the same way that the sensible objects do. It cannot be imperfectly real in Plato's mind, and yet it must be imperfectly real in that it changes over time.